Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's kind of late at night while I'm recording this, so I don't know. Hopefully I make sense. I've got some caffeine next to me to keep me going, but today we're going to be talking about the Nancy Drew book, The Phantom of Pine Hill. So this is book number 42, and it was first published in 1965, and we're getting so close to being to the end of the original Yellow Spines. Like, I feel like it was just yesterday that I started reading these books, and it's like, I don't know, it's kind of bittersweet. I mean, I am getting really excited to get into some of the newer books from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s and on because, I don't know, I feel like we get to see a different side of Nancy. I'm really excited for the Nancy Drew Files. Yeah, because while some of my favorite books are the originals, I really do like some of the later books too. They are just so neat and have maybe a little bit more cohesive plots. Not always. Sometimes they're just as out there. So before I jump into discussing the book cover for The Phantom of Pine Hill, I am going to give a little bit of a trigger warning, and I'll put this in the show notes as well. And I kind of mentioned it last episode at the end of The Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. In this book, we have some desecrating of Native American burial grounds, which is not cool, but it's in this book, so I just wanted to put that out there. It's kind of unfortunate. I mean, I'm really against, any kind of grave digging. It's just one of those things. I don't mind if Nancy goes into a graveyard, but if we start digging with shovels, I'm like, okay, we probably should draw the line with that. So there is one book cover that I was able to find for The Phantom of Pine Hill, and it's got a primarily white background, and there's a cliff on the left side of the book cover with pine trees, hence Pine Hill, and it has Nancy and Ned looking up at the hill. Nancy's wearing this really pretty blue dress. She's got the strawberry blonde hair. He's wearing what looks to be like Native American traditional garb, or it's probably kind of like, I don't know. He's got this feather headdress on. Yeah. So there's a little bit of an issue there with that, but there is a man up on the hill. It's just a shadowy figure. He looks really pale. Like, his face looks super white, and he's wearing like a black turtleneck. He looks like what you would imagine a burglar would look like. And a ghostly burglar is actually what we're dealing with in this book, so it's appropriate. So I came up with a couple funny cover spoofs for The Phantom of Pine Hill, and the first one is The Phantom of Cultural Appropriation, because, Ned is just kind of wearing this feather headdress, and I don't know, there's a bunch of things in this book that are a little bit insensitive. But then the second cover spoof that I came up with is Herman Munster on the hillside, because this guy, I don't know, whoever drew him gave him a really long face. Like, I don't think he's wearing a mask. His face looks a little bit odd to me. So I gave this cover a rating of 3 magnifying glasses. It's not one of my favorite book covers, but it's not the worst out there. I mean, culturally insensitive things aside, I feel like it does kind of encapsulate some parts of the mystery. And also, before I jump into discussing the characters, I just have to get this off my chest. So, I don't know if you guys ever read the Babysitter's Club books, but I was like really into those as a kid too. Like, those were peak 90s books for me, along with the Nancy Drew series. And I remember Claudia, which she was one of my favorite characters in that book series. In one of the books, don't remember which one, she specifically references The Phantom of Pine Hill. She says she's reading it. And so I remember as a kid being like, oh, I've got that book. I'm going to read that book just like Claudia did. I probably wanted to be like Claudia the most out of all of the Babysitter's Club characters because she was just so artsy and neat, and I don't know. It just kind of reminds me of that girl in the original Mean Girls. She was like, Regina wore army pants and flip-flops, so I wore army pants and flip-flops. I mean, if you can't emulate some of your favorite literary characters, then what's the point of living? Okay, so moving on from that worlds colliding moment, here are some of the characters in The Phantom of Pine Hill. So we have John Rorick, and he's nicknamed Uncle John in this book. He's the uncle of a professor at Emerson College, and he lets Nancy, Bess, and George stay with him to solve this mystery. There's Miss Holman, who is his housekeeper. There's Fred Jenkins. I put Klutz in parentheses. He helps out around Uncle John's house. And there is Tom Aiken and Ben Farmer. And they are just some friends of Ned's, and they actually are descendants of some of the Lucy Bell passengers. And the Lucy Bell is a boat that went down near Emerson College, and it plays heavily into the story. So without further ado, here's the synopsis for The Phantom of Pine Hill. Nancy, Bess, and George go to Emerson College for June week, but their hotel reservations have been lost. Ned says they can stay with the uncle of a professor if they promise to solve the mystery of the phantom. Strange lights have been seen at Pine Hill, and things have been going missing. Nancy, Bess, and George go to stay at John Rorick's place, and the library is ransacked and money goes missing. While enjoying fraternity activities, the girls, along with Ned, Burt, and Dave, inquire about the wreck of a ship, the Lucy Bell, and some missing cargo. Nancy is able to catch the phantom, get back Uncle John's stolen money, and even locate his family's long-lost heirlooms. So for the newspaper headline synopsis, I came up with Artifacts from Long Sunken Ship Found on Emerson Campus by Nancy Drew and Friends. I don't know, I feel like my synopses, is that the plural for synopsis? I feel like I've been making them a little bit shorter lately because I have so many notes on the books, like I've been going into overdrive, so we'll go ahead and jump right into those notes now. So, as I said in the synopsis, Nancy, Bess, and George have gone to June week at Emerson College. They get to hang out with Ned, Burt, and Dave, and they have a lot of things that their fraternity is doing. There's like a dance and a parade of boats and stuff, but they go there, and the hotel that they were going to stay at can't find their reservation. So Ned pulls some strings with John Rorick, and he says, well, you guys can stay with him if you solve this mystery. There's some phantom, things are going missing from his house, but there's no sign of forced entry, and we need to figure out what's going on. So Nancy, Bess, and George take their stuff up to his house, and they later go back to Emerson to like a barbecue to eat and hang out with people. And there's this guy named Fred, and he's the one I referenced in our characters. He is Fred Jenkins. So he spills drinks all over Nancy. So Ned's really aggravated on her behalf, and Nancy is too, you can tell, but she's just like, she tries to play it cool. She says, I'll just go back to the house and change. So she goes back up to Mr. Rorick's house to change, and she sees that her pearl necklace has been stolen. So the Phantom of Pine Hill is already working overtime. Like, it didn't even take, 30 minutes, a few hours, the girls left their stuff up there and there's already stuff missing. So it's not a good sign. Or it wouldn't be a good sign for most people, but Nancy, it's perfect because she loves to solve mysteries. Like, she wasn't even really disappointed about the hotel reservations being canceled. She was just like, oh, cool, I get to stay somewhere else and I get a mystery, bonus. So Nancy reports the pearls as being stolen to the police, and they kind of make some comments that would have made me mad. They're like, well, are you sure you didn't misplace them? I'm like, no, never say that to a woman who's missing jewelry, even if it's true. But John Rorick says at this point, he explains to Nancy, he says he had relatives who came from France and they settled on Pine Hill. He's giving her the backstory of the entire home and his life story. But one of these relatives was said to have been getting a shipment from the Queen of France, but it was presumed lost on the sunken ship, the Lucy Bell. So Nancy kind of files that information away, and since they're already up there at the house, her and Bess and George go and check out John's library, and this is the weird thing about it. So his library is locked up. They have a padlock on it, but still, somehow, things have been going missing from the library, and the lock hasn't been disturbed. So they go in the library and they discover his method of hiding money in books. So let's say he has $150. He would leave that on page 150 of a certain book. And I think he even left it in books that had to do with his name, like maybe his initials or something, which was really cool, but also, kind of bad because it turns out that Nancy has a hunch. She's like, maybe the Phantom is breaking in here to get this money. Oh, okay, I remember. So his last name is Rorik. It sounds like roar. I think he was leaving it in books that had roar in the title, like the Roaring Twenties. So it's at this point in the mystery that Nancy goes back over to Emerson, and her and Ned kind of have a picnic lunch, and Fred Jenkins, he gets caught eavesdropping on them. And so Nancy was telling Ned about her theory about the library and how, maybe the Phantom's getting in there to steal money and her pearl necklace has gone missing. And so Fred overheard every bit of that. So Fred should have jumped to your suspect number 1 on your suspect list, but they describe him in the book as being kind of like slow-witted, like he's very, he just watches people. He's not very quick to respond, and he's just kind of clumsy. And I'm like, you know what, though? Those are the ones you got to look out for, the ones that play it a little bit too good, that they're dumb or that they don't, get the whole story, if you know what I'm saying. So the next note that I took down is Nancy watches Ned's rowing team win a race, and then they go out in a canoe to find where the Lucy Belle sank. And it's at this point that they see this man watching them with binoculars, and then a speedboat hits their canoe and it sinks. So yet another boating accident. My next note says Nancy is walking through the woods around Mr. Rorik's house, and there's a piece of paper that just kind of floats down to her with 2 thumbprints on it. It's really weird. They're just described as really just 2 abnormally large thumbprints. And she looks up in the trees and looks all around, and she can't figure out where it came from. So she holds on to it because it's weird and it's evidence. But I'm like, okay, if you're a villain, like how dumb would you have to be, though? Just like, here's my fingerprints. You can just run them in the DNA database. I know they were kind of like still getting that off the ground back then, but just not a smart move. So the next thing I took note of is Bess says the dance they're going to is going to be a honey. I had never heard this saying before. It just sounds so 60s to me. It's going to be a honey. Like, I guess that means it's going to be fun. It's going to be sweet, I guess. I don't know, but that's kind of cool. I also thought it was neat in this scene because we get a really detailed description of what the girls are wearing. So it says Bess is wearing a fluffy dress, George a pale green silk dress, and Nancy a yellow linen dress with embroidered white birds and flowers and a full skirt. And when she comes downstairs, Fred sees her and he says, "You look positively super." And then he drops a vase. So Nancy's just kind of standing there in her best dress and her heels, and she's just like, oh no, what do I do? And then Fred says, "See what you made me do? You shouldn't be so beautiful." Like, yet again, Nancy Drew gets told that she's beautiful on an almost daily basis, but Fred sweeps up the vase and Miss Holman scolds him for being so clumsy. So my next note says, Nancy discovers money missing from the books in the library, and Miss Holman is called away on a family emergency. So Nancy starts to eliminate Miss Holman from her suspect list at this point because she's like, well, she's going to check on family, so if there's money missing after this, it can't be her. But the money has been moved, so the $150 is now $140, and it's been moved to page 140. So Nancy now knows without a shadow of a doubt that the Phantom is breaking into Pine Hill to steal the money, and she actually does call the relatives of Miss Holman to confirm that she's there, so she's off the suspect list. So Nancy gets a lead on a Mrs. Palmer, who is a bit of an older lady, and she knows a lot about the Lucy Belle. So her, Bess, and George go to talk to her, and she tells them that the Lucy Belle supposedly had gold coins on board. So Nancy starts to think maybe this is another reason why the Phantom wants Mr. Rorik to get scared and leave, because if this ship sunk in the river down from his house, if he were to leave, the criminals would have free range and they could look for the treasure. So my next note has to do with what else but George being mean to Bess. So Bess says she's hungry, and George says, "That seems to be a perpetual complaint of yours. What happened to that diet you were going to follow?" And Bess says she's lost 7 pounds, and George retorts, "Which you'll put right back on if you don't stop stuffing yourself." Like, George, we should stuff you in the trunk of a car. Like, you're so mean. Like, this is your cousin. Like, why? Why do you talk to Bess like this? I don't understand it. So in this next scene in the book, George plays a prank on Nancy and Ned, and I thought this was kind of unlike George, because usually George is like so serious and she's like, no, we have a mystery to solve and get it together, you guys. So the fact that she's playing a prank on Nancy and Ned was funny to me. But Nancy said she's going to stake out the library to catch the Phantom at night, and George pulls a pillowcase over Ned's head, and I don't know how George didn't get punched in the face, because Ned has a mean right hook. So Nancy kind of scolds George about it, but they do have a good laugh about it, and it's at this point when she decides, I think I'm going to hide this money, because the Phantom is obviously getting in here and stealing it, so she takes the money and moves it. So the next day, while the girls are out, the library gets completely ransacked, and Nancy believes it's not only because the money was moved, but that the thief is looking for something else. So Nancy finds another paper with thumbprints on it, which I was like, okay, I guess this is this guy's signature. Just call him Tom Thumbs. And so Nancy gets a new lock for the door for the library, and the guy assures her, he's like, this is state of the art. It's the top lock that's selling on the market right now. So she gets that with Mr. Rorick's permission and puts it on the door. And who notices the lock being put on the library door but Fred Jenkins? He is so nosy. So he comes up and he's like trying to figure out what Nancy's doing, because he's over there always doing like odd chores around the house. And so Nancy is just so suspicious of him. I think Fred even makes a comment like, that won't do any good. Like, the Phantom gets through everything. So it's like, okay. Fred, are you the Phantom? But it's while Bess, Nancy, and George are putting all the books back together in the ransacked library, they get another lead on the Lucy Bell. So they find a book that has the list of survivors from the Lucy Bell, and the girls go to Miss Palmer and they track down their descendants, who are Ben Farmer and Tom Aiken. And they just so happen to have connections with Emerson. How about that? So Nancy gets to talk to them, and Ben says that his ancestors were killed by Native Americans in the area, and Ben just says they must have had their reasons, which I thought was kind of a refreshing take. You know, he's not like, yeah, my ancestors are the best, they were perfect people. He was like, no, they probably did something and upset the people that were originally living here. So the next note that I took down is the girls watch the fraternity do a processional boat parade showing the history of Emerson, and it says that Burt is dressed as a captain, Dave is wearing a wig and on a boat with a bunch of horses and cows, which that just sounds so chaotic, and messy. But anyway, Ned is dressed as a Native American chief, and he runs up on the bank and he carries Nancy away, and Nancy, it says, is just completely embarrassed. And then Ned says, big chief take pretty maiden to treasure spot. It's like, Ned, can we not? Like, you can just tell he watched some of the westerns and stuff that were around at the time. It's like, no. Like, people don't talk like that, and it's just, so bad. So Ned takes Nancy to an area where he thinks the Lucy Bell could have gone down, and they find an anchor, but it's for a different ship, so it's a false lead. But Nancy is so close to Pine Hill, she decides to go up to the house, and Ned escorts her. And honestly, I think she was like too embarrassed to go back to everybody at the boat race or the boat parade thing, because I'm like, how do you really come back from that when your boyfriend just picks you up out of the crowd and runs away with you wearing, what he's wearing? So they're walking back up to the house and they hear a scream, and Nancy puts her ear to the ground, which she's done this in a few books. I think she did this in The Message of the Hollow Oak and a few others, to hear footsteps, but they don't find a soul. So they get back up to the house and they meet Miss Holman, and they find the library has been ransacked again, but Nancy does find a map. So this Phantom, they keep tearing the library apart, and then they just keep leaving clues that Nancy just easily unearths. It's kind of funny because it's like, are they trying to leave these clues for her so she can ultimately solve the mystery for them? That's kind of the vibe that I'm getting. So Nancy's looking at this map, and she's beginning to think that the coins could have been stolen from the Lucy Bell wreckage and then buried near a Native American village. So Ned continues with his awkward portrayal of Native Americans and says, meet Indian Princess Nonaviki. She helped Chief solve heap big Indian mystery. Ned, you need to go back to college and do some more learning. But on the bright side, we get another outfit description, and it says Nancy is wearing a pale green two-piece outfit with a slightly full skirt that has intriguing geometric designs in brilliant colors on one side of the sleeveless blouse. And then Bess is wearing pink, it says, and George is wearing black chiffon with a pearl necklace and earrings, which that sounds pretty dressy for George. So my next note just says Ned gets voted in as president of his fraternity. Like, I kind of saw that coming, but Nancy's like beaming with pride and like so excited for him, but it is kind of cool. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy gets a threatening note, and it says, "Go home at once, danger from the Phantom." I don't know, some of the threats from the villains in Nancy Drew books are really cheesy, but some of them are really creepy. Like, just the fact that they went to that trouble is just, sends a chill down your spine. So after this, Nancy starts going around and tapping all the walls at Pine Hill. She's trying to find a secret passageway because she's like, there has to be a way that the Phantom is getting in here and robbing everybody blind. And she finds this workshop area in the basement of the house, and she gets knocked out by a door that falls on her. And George goes all lumberjack and takes an axe to the door since they can't get the door to the workshop open and they can't hear Nancy. They've been calling her name and she's not responding. So they're really worried about her, but they get in there and they're able to get the other door off of the top of her. It's just like, gosh. Nancy gets knocked out a lot. Okay, so we're to another part of this book that's a little bit problematic, but the girls set off to explore a Native American village that they found on the map. And Bess asks what the weed-covered large humps are, and Nancy thinks they're clay ovens used to bake bread. And I just said in my notes, are they? Are they though? Like I said, my first thought was a burial mound. But hold that thought, because Fred shows up and he says, "Nancy, you've got to go back to the house. Hannah Gruen is sick and you got a phone call." So Nancy does, but I noticed, and I think she noticed too, in the note that he took down from the phone call, supposed phone call, it says Green, not Gruen. And I said, I don't trust this Fred guy. So big surprise, Nancy goes back to the house and calls Hannah to check on her, and she's absolutely fine. So Hannah gets worried and she tells Nancy this, but Nancy says, "No Phantom is going to give me orders." And Hannah says, if the whole matter weren't serious, that would be an utterly ridiculous statement. And they have a good laugh about it, but Nancy says, "I hope the Phantom is listening because I'm not going to drop the case." So back to that thought you were holding, the girls go back to the village and they find that someone was digging while they were gone, and they chase this man off in a canoe, and then they go back to digging. And surprise, surprise, the girls find a Native American person's body. Just, we couldn't leave well enough alone. And I just put, it's not good to desecrate graves, y'all. But there's an Emerson professor that shows up and he takes the body because Nancy thinks it would be, quote, great for a museum. Like, no. Leave the body in the ground where it was. Like, don't disturb it. So next, the girls find a cave, and they find this ribbon that says Bell on it from the hat of a sailor, and they determine that this must have come from the Lucy Bell, and they chase this guy who's been spying on them again. This guy keeps looking at them through binoculars from near Pine Hill, and he gets away in a canoe, and so they're trying to figure out who this person is. So it's while they're doing this that Nancy and George go tumbling down an embankment, and they see Fred going off in a boat, but he doesn't offer to help them at all. Yet more points against Fred. So George gets mad and she says she thinks Fred is too stupid to be involved in this mystery, but Nancy isn't so sure. So they start investigating Fred's life outside of Pine Hill, and they figure out that he lives with his dad, who looks like the man who's been spying on them. So they chase him and he gets away. But the girls are also able to interview Fred's landlord, and she says she thinks he's simple because he was a boxer. Like, I guess she's making this assumption that he was punched in the head a lot. But Nancy tells the woman she wanted Fred to wash her car, so she has an excuse to be asking all these questions about him. So later, Nancy gets back from a date that she's gone on with Ned, and her car has been stolen. But it's back in the driveway the next morning, and Nancy asks Fred about it, and he says, "Didn't you want it washed?" So Nancy knows he started it without a key, but how did he do that? And also, that was a total power move on Fred's part, because he's telling Nancy, like, I know you've been asking about me and prying around in my life. So my next note is Nancy finds grass clippings in front of the safe in the library, and when Uncle John opens the safe, he sees that all his money is gone. So Nancy had encouraged Uncle John to move all the money to the safe because it was obviously getting stolen from the books in the library, but now they see that didn't even work. The Phantom has still been getting in and stealing it. But that was pretty much his whole life savings and also a really expensive coin collection, so he's just like devastated. So this next thing that I wrote down is kind of funny, but Dave ends up falling down the chimney at Pine Hill trying to investigate, like they're trying to figure out if there's a secret passageway through the chimney into the library, and George and Burt have to pull him out, and George draws a sketch of him and calls it Santa Claus Goes to Meet the Phantom. So it's while they're doing that Nancy and Ned go diving to find the Lucy Bell, and Nancy's oxygen hose gets tangled in the wreckage, but Ned saves her. So I remember this having such an impression on me as a kid. I was like, oh, that would be so cool, but so creepy. I don't know. Something about shipwrecks is so fascinating to me. It's like, this should not be here on the bottom of this river or the ocean. But I remember being so scared for Nancy then and now, because that's terrifying. Also, I've never been scuba diving before, but I've heard from so many people and watched videos. I've gone down like rabbit holes of people scuba diving, and they say that you have to be so careful in the wreckage because everything is different and it's easy to get snagged on stuff and just, I don't know. It'd be cool to do once, but I don't think I'd make a habit out of scuba diving. I love Nancy, but I am definitely more of a Bess. Like, let me go shopping any day. So Nancy and Ned go by Fred's house and they tail him and his father to a cabin. And Ned makes up this charming little rhyme, and he says, Snoopy Ned Nickerson went to the cupboard to find Nancy Drew a clue, but when he got there, the cupboard was bare, and so there was no clue for Drew. Ned Nickerson, you've been putting your foot in your mouth a lot in this mystery. I have not forgotten what you said earlier. So lo and behold, Ned actually does find a clue, and it's a key-making machine. And he carries it out and puts it in the trunk of Nancy's car so Fred and his dad can't use it anymore. But that's how he was able to start Nancy's car. He made a copy of the key. The next thing that I wrote down is Nancy finally finds how the Phantom has been getting into the library, and it's through a concealed passageway in the fireplace, so they weren't far off base when they were looking in the chimney. But they find Mr. Rorick's coin collection in there, and Nancy makes a plan, and she's like, we're going to hide in the library and catch the Phantom. So they leave the coins there so as not to arouse suspicion. And then Nancy encourages Mr. Rorick to talk about jewelry that he's going to put in the safe so Fred will overhear. And then the girls sneak back to hide in the library while Fred is taking the trash. And later, his dad comes through this secret door that they found. So Nancy and George try to apprehend Fred's dad, and he sprays them in the face with something, and they just knock out and fall to the floor. And then Bess, brave Bess Marvin, she throws a book into him and knocks him out cold. I just love when Bess saves the day. So she creeps back out through the passageway, and Fred comes in, and he's like, oh, I didn't think you were here. And so she keeps him busy by flirting with him until the police show up. So Fred's dad was the one that stole Nancy's pearl necklace, and he actually tells her where she can find it. And Nancy makes the comment, she's like, a thief has never given me something back before. And then my last note says they finally find the chests from the Lucy Bell, and Uncle John says he'll give the miniatures of the king and queen to the first of the girls to get married. And it's so funny because it says Nancy, Bess, and George all blush and change the subject. So for the What's Cookin' segment of this podcast, I usually like to say things that Hannah Gruen cooked specifically, but I will mention other things that were cooked in the book. And since Nancy, Bess, and George were over at Pine Hill most of the time, this was stuff that they themselves cooked or Miss Holman cooked. So at one point they had broiled chicken, mashed potatoes, peas, salad, ice cream, and cake. In another section of the book, Bess makes scrambled eggs, toast, and cocoa. There's cold cuts, potato salad, ripe tomatoes, and chocolate mousse cake. And then George makes Nancy a boiled egg, some toast, and orange juice after that door falls on her. I guess we'll just call that the concussion diet. So for the add that to your resume section of this podcast, I said that Nancy is a grave robber because, she just upsets this person's grave and just is like, oh yeah, this should be in a museum. It's so awful. And she's an underwater shipwreck explorer, which is much cooler if you ask me. So for the things that I liked about the Phantom of Pine Hill, we got to see more of Emerson College, which was really cool. There's Treasure. I always love Treasure. And Bess's bravery. I love that she had to save Nancy and George. And the things I didn't like about Phantom of Pine Hill, digging up people's graves. That's just that's just something you shouldn't do. And it took Nancy an unusually long time to find that passageway. I mean, I feel like in Lilac Inn, she was tapping and then she was like, oh, cool, here it is. But in this book, it wasn't until like maybe 20 pages till the end that we found the passageway. Like, Nancy may be socially inept when it comes to digging up people, but she's good at finding passageways. So that was a little bit unbelievable to me. So in conclusion, I gave The Phantom of Pine Hill 4 magnifying glasses. There were some things I didn't like, but it was overall a really good book. And, towards the end, we do start to get a feel for who the villain is. It's not too big of a surprise, but it was really a well-written book and entertaining to read. So for next week's episode, if you like France and lots of steps, you're going to love this one. It's The Mystery of the 99 Steps, and I hope you guys will tune in next week for that episode. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.